Well, this is sort of, I regard this as the freebie lecture that you could sit out if you had a massage, because it's just sort of it's something which I discovered is one way of putting it, or dreamed up is another. And it's, if nothing else, it demonstrates the slippery nature of ideas. And depending on the audience I'm talking to, I present it different ways. Like sometimes I present it as God's truth. And then, like in Austria at this art thing, I presented it as a work of conceptual art. Yes, safer, right? So, and it's a concept, it's an idea that small computers, such as we're looking at, came along just in time, or about 5 years after I first needed them. So I'll just sort of talk about it a little bit and feel my way into it. It's more fun to play with than to discuss the theoretics of. But if you don't, if you don't have some appreciation for the theory, then it doesn't make any sense at all. The basic notion is, or the way in which this idea parts company from ordinary science, is there is the idea that there is something which has been overlooked in the categorizing of the forces which shape and maintain the cosmos. Something has been overlooked. And I call this something novelty, following Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy as put forth in Process and Reality. So novelty, and one way of thinking of it, if you have a background in Eastern philosophy, is Tao. What we're talking about here is pretty much something like the Tao, but we are going to call it novelty. And it comes and goes in the world according to mysterious and unfathomable rules. And it builds structure up, dynastic families, corporations, nation-states, and it pulls structure down according to some whim or some unimaginable algorithm, or previously unimaginable algorithm. And part of what got me started thinking along these lines was simply trying to make mathematical models of Tao. In other words, taking the statements at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching and taking them as mathematical formalisms, and then seeing what the constraints were on a system that operated along those lines. Well, eventually that led me to look at the I Ching, which is sort of the text par excellence relative to this idea that time has qualities. And this idea of the ebb and flow of novelty that I was playing with, I discovered was a notion that was very old in the East. It's not a notion that's even tolerated in Western thinking, because science, in order to do its business, must have the assumption that experiments are time independent. That whether you do an experiment on a Tuesday or a Saturday, this is not a valid parameter of the experiment. However, this idea is suggesting something else. It's suggesting that time actually does have a quality, and that this quality, so far introduced as novelty, and its opposite, and I used to call its opposite entropy, but at Rupert Sheldrake's urging, I now call it habit. And so this is a kind of Manichaean cosmology in which habit and novelty are in a constant struggle with each other, one gaining dominance for a period of time, and then the other gaining dominance in an endless, dynamic relationship. The result of which, over long periods of time, is that novelty is conserved I think I used this phrase last night in the introductory talk, but without explaining the ideas which lay behind it. But the idea is that from the psychedelic point of view, or from this point of view, the universe is perceived as a kind of engine for producing and distilling and maintaining novelty, and passing novelty on to yet higher states of novelty, each level of novelty somehow allowing the emergence of properties previously forbidden at more constrained levels, so that the whole thing is a bootstrapping process to greater and greater novelty and self-reflection. Well, so that's the basic notion. Then the idea is, following the statement of the Tao Te Ching that the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way, and following the ideas implicit in the I Ching that time is a succession of irreducible elements, that time in some way is made of irreducible elements in the same way that matter has been discovered by Western science to be made of irreducible elements. So somehow time is not simply a plenum, a featureless, homogeneous surface upon which the experiments of Newtonian causality can be carried out. But actually, when we look at it at the level, the fine-grained level of experience, within the context of a love affair or a dynastic family's rise and fall or something like that, we see then, that it's permeated with qualities. And in the West, these qualities were identified by the Greeks and called fate, and said, to be is to be fate-laden. Somehow the fates impinge on our lives and lead us to our destinies. Science got rid of all this, and then we just had, flying atoms whizzing around in nothingness, leading to some inevitable casuistry dictated by mathematics. Well, okay, I don't want to say too much more about the theoretics of it, but inevitably the question comes up once we get into the wave, where did you say you got this wave again? And the answer is it arose from a fairly stone circumstances, but a fairly dry problem. Meaning, I was quite swept away and in the grip of the mushroom and so forth on a scale of weeks and years, not days. But it posed a conundrum, a koan, a peculiar and confined problem, which was, what is the nature of the order of the King Wen sequence? Now, background. The King Wen sequence is a certain arrangement of the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. And this particular arrangement is very old, found on shoulder bones, 3,500 years old, and so forth. So it was simply asking a formal question. What are the rules which produce the King Wen sequence? It's always called a sequence. It's always revered as one of the oldest of human abstractions. But what in fact is the sequence? Well, in looking at that, and I won't try to lead you through it tonight unless in a question and answer period some maniac insists. But what it boils down to is that in the King Wen sequence of the I Ching, there is embedded a fractal algorithm. A fractal algorithm very much like the fractal algorithms that have been discovered in just the past 7 or 8 years by modern mathematics using high-speed computers. But the interesting thing about this fractal algorithm inside the I Ching is that it actually appears to make good on the claim which the I Ching has always been so concerned to make, namely that it was a piece of prophetistic machinery for mapping future time. In other words, that it was a predictive engine for knowing the future. So what I brought out of it, or what I was led to find within it by the promptings of the mushroom genies, was a certain pattern that I was able to mathematically nail to the wall and define. And then all the computer does here is time scale this pattern. And then I will become the devil's advocate for this thing. And I will claim to you that this undulating wave on the screen actually describes the career of novelty in time, in all places, throughout the history of the universe. And we will look at big pieces of time, little pieces of time, and you will quickly get the idea that whether this is quote-unquote true or not, this is some kind of weird heuristic device that has about it the ozone stench of otherworldliness. I mean, it was not thought up by the unaided human mind. There's a kind of seamless completedness to it that marks it not as a discovery or an invention, but as an artifact of some other order. Well, so now let's look at the screen, and if I can come up with a pointer, and even if I can. And I'll show you how this game is played, if the software will cooperate. The software is very good. It was written by Peter Meyer. The idea existed before the software, but before the software, these screens that you're going to see, it took an entire day to make one of them, and it just left you, you know, red-eyed and tremoring, and there was the possibility for hundreds of arithmetic errors, and any one of which would throw off the signature. So the invention of small computers in 1977 really opened this up for us. Before, we ran telephone directory size lists of numbers, which we could then look up and you know, go off and then produce graphs somewhat like this. Okay, now I know it's hard to see, but the main thing you have to see is the line and what it's doing, and then I'll try and explain everything else and make sense of it. These are novelty units along this axis, and we've never named them, but you can think of them as escatons or whatever, whitehead-ons. But this is the important axis, and this is the time axis. Now, what's being portrayed on the screen right now is 6 billion years. 6 billion years. In other words, a time span longer than most people require for the life of this planet. The Earth is thought to have condensed around 5.5 billion years ago. And that very fact is portrayed here, because now here's a convention that you have to internalize, or nothing from this point on will make sense. It's very simple, but it's somewhat counterintuitive. It's that when the line moves down, novelty is increasing. When the line moves down, novelty is increasing. When the line moves up, habit or entropy or recidivistic tendencies are increasing. Okay, well, so then looking at the life of the universe on the scale of 6 billion years, you see why I say it's an engine for the conservation of novelty. Because novelty, though there have been some severe setbacks, like here, generally novelty has been conserved. And right now, we're down in here, in this stochastic noise and damped oscillation at the very end of the cycle, so close to the zero value, which is the maximum value for novelty, that for all practical purposes at this scale, we can be said to be next to the zero value. And this is, I maintain, what accounts for the chaotic and highly novel nature of modern history or the 20th century. It's that we are so near the zero value, the maximum value for novelty, that it's actually like there's an anticipatory image seeping through, which contorts the 20th century into the kind of apocalyptic, image-riddled social space that it is. Well, now, let's see, God willing, we can make this thing zoom in. Zoom? Yes. So now we have 750 million years on the screen, and what was previously stochastic noise lost near the 0 point is beginning to emerge instead as a repetitious landscape of deep lunges toward novelty. So now, how to interpret this? This is about 500 million years ago. So that big downsweep was the emergence of very simple life forms. But the major career of biology has gone on along this sawtoothed edge that is about 500 million years from here to here. And this is in good accordance with the fossil record. This is where the great speciations and extinctions took place after the establishment of the chordata about 500 million years ago. Okay, now I'll restart the zoom. Do you begin to get the idea of how, what you as the viewer or the jury or whatever should be asking yourself is, does the wave fit my personal interpretation and understanding of novelty as we move through time? Because we're obviously, at this scale, it's pretty much up for grabs. I mean, because we're talking about such generalized events as the emergence of life and so forth. But we're going to get down on it. We're going to enter at some point the cognizable domains of known history. I mean, let's say since the fall of the Roman Empire, or since the fall of Richard Nixon, you know, depending on how long your memory is. Okay, let me get this thing going again here. Here is the last 100 million years. Now, I stopped the screen here because there is an event in the last 100 million years which this thing would have to successfully predict in order to proceed further as a successful theory. It's that 65 million years ago, either there was an enormous volcanic eruption on the surface of the Earth like nothing anybody has ever seen or imagined, or there was a planetesimal impact on the North Atlantic Ridge, which seems to be the more probable candidate for what happened. And this laid down the so-called iridium here 65 million years ago. It's a perfect hit. In other words, the two cannot be dated precisely enough that we can't say that one is not precisely the other. So this is our first here at 65 million years ago. And actually there was one earlier, I think 170 million years ago, which it also picks up. But we've shot beyond that. So now, and that was the event which caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Nothing larger than a chicken walked away from this event on the entire planet right here. And it gave the permission for the emergence of the mammals, and the whole phyla of the Earth took a sudden different turn, which was explored along here until about 45 million years ago. And then there was some kind of carrying capacity problem, or who knows what it is. This is really approaching the height of the speciation of the age of mammals occurred about 35 million years ago at the bottom of this trough. Okay, so what we're looking at here is 100 million years, and this is the period in which we emerged as a species out of arboreal primates, out of bipedal proto-hominids on the grasslands of Africa. We come out of this, but most of the action for us as a thinking species is on this this period here toward the very end, this perfect kind of volcanic-looking cone, which I call history's fractal mountain, and which is sort of the signature of the whole wave, as you'll see as we get into it. Okay, now let's again start the zoom, 5 million years. And let's look at this.